Thanks so much. Yeah, the reason I don't have a bio is I had a baby 6 months ago, so I'm still a little scattered with these sorts of things, but that may be a bit why. So, hi everyone. As Greg said, I'm Brittany Hanrahan. I got my PhD at Notre Dame, and I'm trained as a stream ecologist, so really comes sort of from the water quality biology part of this, and I'm a research biologist with Kevin's group in Columbus. So, I just kind of want to step back and think about the context of this work really quickly and sort of the context of this session. And that really is that excess NNP can be exported from agricultural lands. And agriculture is the dominant land use across much of the Midwestern U.S. And just in the Lake Erie Basin alone, it compromises about 75% of the land use. And this is important because it is the largest contributor, or one of the largest contributors of total phosphorus and total nitrogen to Lake Erie. So this figure here from Robertson and Sod 2011 just shows the different, sources of nutrients to each of the Great Lakes. So with this box, I'm highlighting Lake Erie, and the furthest bars on the left here show total contributions from different sources. So in the orange here, yellow, and dark red are agricultural sources from either fertilizers or manure, confined or unconfined. So it's just this really large portion of total phosphorus and total nitrogen that are entering the lake. And this is problematic because NNP fuel algal blooms once they enter these downstream systems. So excess NNP sort of fertilize these algal blooms, and once those algal blooms die and decompose, oxygen is stripped from the water column, which makes it really problematic for the biological communities that work there, that live there, creating areas of hypoxia or low oxygen zones where these things can no longer live. And there are now greater than 400 hypoxic zones that occur around the globe. Many of these are in locations that are downstream or downriver of either dense agricultural areas or densely populated urban areas. And if we again come back to sort of this Lake Erie example, this is exemplified by the algal blooms that occur in the lake that we hear so much about every year. So then I wanted to sort of think about factors controlling nitrogen and phosphorus loss, and when we think about these things, it's really important to consider fertilizer and fertilizer management, because the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that is exported from agricultural lands largely depends on the way that fertilizer is managed. So things like application rate, application method, and application timing have really large effects on the amount of NNP that is lost from an agricultural field. So in this study, a group was looking at rivers that are in the Mississippi River Basin and just relating fertilizer use here on the x-axis to total nitrogen within the river. And they found this really positive linear relationship between fertilizer use and nitrogen in the river, demonstrating that as fertilizer increases, nutrient loss also increases. And another example would be work from looking at fertilizer timing. So as days after litter application increased, actual runoff, phosphorus in runoff, decreased over time. So demonstrating that application timing has, again, a really important impact on the amount of fertilizer that is leaving the system. But fertilizer source can also be important. So whether the fertilizer is either inorganic or organic can influence these nitrogen and phosphorus losses, with some studies showing that watersheds or fields that apply manure application actually have higher nutrient losses than fields without manure. And I just want to highlight that the 4R framework can sort of help address these issues, applying things at the right time, right rates, using the right method, etc. Really can be important. I'm not going to speak about this, but it's just I wanted to note that here first. So the way that we decided to look at this was using nutrient balances, which is really just an accounting system of all of the inputs and all of the outputs from an individual agricultural field. And it's a way to estimate nutrient accumulation, depletion, or equilibrium, whether your inputs and your outputs are equal to one another within a field itself. So this is an example, a conceptual diagram from a watershed balance in Illinois. And it just shows these inputs include things like fertilizer, nitrogen fixation, and outputs include things like crop harvest and stream export in a watershed example. And the result here was that after accounting for all of the inputs and all of the outputs, there was a surplus of nitrogen within the watershed. So that N then remains there to be exported to downstream systems. And previous studies have indicated that there's a positive relationship between nitrogen and phosphorus balances and nutrient losses. Just again showing this positive relationship between nutrient loss, N loss in this case on the x-axis, and nitrogen balance on the y-axis here. So as we increase the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus that's in a system, we can also expect nutrient loss to increase as well. So with all of that context, our objectives were to quantify nitrogen and phosphorus balances across agricultural fields in northwestern Ohio, to evaluate the influence of fertilizer sources on these N and P balances, and then to examine the relationship between N and P balances and fertilizer application. So just a sort of brief background about our methods. We use the edge of field network, so Kevin's edge of field network in northwestern Ohio, which is made up of about 40 sites or 20 paired fields. And each of these sites are measured continuously for water, nitrogen, and phosphorus concentration from both surface and subsurface runoff. And then this is what we use to estimate these annual N and P balances as well as the N and P losses from individual fields. So farmers were kind enough to provide all of their management information so that we could quantify inputs and outputs from each of the fields. So what we did were, this is just a conceptual diagram of the balances that we ended up calculating, and we included N inputs were things like fertilizer, nitrogen fixation, and N outputs were things like denitrification, so the microbial mediated process where nitrogen is turned into N2 gas and removed permanently from the system. And then crop removal. And for phosphorus, the only input was fertilizer, and the only output was crop removal. And that allowed us to then estimate this agronomic or in-field N or P balance, which we then compared to total losses, so the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that were lost in both surface runoff and in the tile drain runoff as well. So if we just sort of start to look at the results here, this is demonstrating on the x-axis here are the individual sites, and on the y-axis are the annual average agronomic or in-field balances for nitrogen on top and phosphorus on bottom. And the colors here represent different fertilizer or nutrient sources. The yellow is inorganic, the orange is mixed, and the red here is organic. And then these white bars are fields that had no phosphorus application at all. And what we see are that these balances are really highly variable across all of our sites. So they range from negative 403 to positive 317 kilograms of N per hectare, and negative 58 to positive 36 kilograms of P per hectare. But when we look at the median for both nitrogen and phosphorus across these fields, they were both negative numbers. And they were both relatively small, negative 7.7 and negative 9.2 for each of these respectively. And this just demonstrates that while these balances may vary between positive and negative numbers in each individual year, overall there's this general trend of reduction or drawdown of these nutrients in the soil profile. So then in contrast, if we look at these N and P losses, we again see the same variability across edge of field sites. The graphs here are set up the same as our last figure, where the edge of field sites are on the x-axis and the y-axis are annual hydrologic loss, so in both the subsurface and surface, it's added together there, of nitrogen and phosphorus. And again, we see this really wide range of variability. We're losing between 7 and 125 kilograms of N per hectare, and 0.4 to 4.7 kilograms of P per hectare. But where the last slide I showed you, the balances were the average or the median balance was negative for both nitrogen and phosphorus, we actually see it positive losses across all sites. And this just indicates that there might be this sort of long-term source of nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil profile that's sort of continuing to leach despite what's applied within an individual year. And I just want to quickly point out before I move on the difference in magnitude in nitrogen and phosphorus. So we have, the amount of nitrogen that we're losing from these fields is much higher than phosphorus. And that's really important to sort of remember that we're already sort of managing phosphorus in a a good way, in a relatively responsible way, but phosphorus causes problems at lower concentrations in environmental systems. So we're working on a much smaller scale, and it's difficult to do that. So then we wanted to look if N&P balances differed among these fertilizer sources. So our first figure here is showing agronomic N balance on the y-axis, and then comparing between inorganic here in the yellow and mixed fertilizer sources for nitrogen specifically. And what we saw was that the median annual N balance was greater in fields receiving these mixed fertilizers than inorganic alone. And this result was similar when we looked at phosphorus here on the y-axis. So median annual P balance was greatest in fields that received organic and mixed fertilizers, here in the red and here in the orange, especially compared to fields that were receiving no phosphorus application at all. And what comes to mind when we're looking at these differences is really application rate. That's a really important driver of what these differences, or why these differences may be occurring. So we looked at average N application on the y-axis and how that controlled average N balance on the y-axis and x-axis, excuse me, and found that both N and P balances increased as application rates increased. So the relationship between agronomic balance and fertilizer application was also stronger for N compared to phosphorus. So this relationship was explaining more of the variability in N balances than the phosphorus balances. And here again I want to just point out a few things about these figures before I move on, because you can see that these fields that were receiving organic sources and mixed sources tend to fall at the higher end of this linear relationship, which is really demonstrating that what's driving the differences in average balance for both N and P is the fact that application rate is higher in those systems that are receiving both mixed and organic fertilizer. So it's really the rate at which things are being applied, not necessarily an inherent difference between manure and inorganic fertilizers. So then we wanted to look at if these N and P losses differed among fertilizer sources, and we saw a very similar trend, that median annual N loss was greater in fields receiving mixed fertilizers. But when we looked at phosphorus, it was a little bit more interesting, because annual P loss was greater in fields receiving organic and mixed fertilizers compared to inorganic fertilizers, but it was actually highest in fields that received no phosphorus application at all. And our hypothesis is this really relates to the soil test phosphorus levels in these fields. So there's a general trend of higher soil test phosphorus in the fields that are not receiving any phosphorus application. So again, pointing to this sort of long-term source that's driving these differences. And finally, we wanted to look at if N and P losses were related to agronomic balances then. So was the amount of N and P in the fields causing higher losses from those individual fields? And we did see that nitrogen loss increased as agronomic balances increased. So the amount of nitrogen in the field was controlling or driving the amount of nitrogen that was lost from that field. But that relationship did not hold true for phosphorus. So there was no relationship between agronomic average P balance within the field and P losses, which we thought was kind of interesting. So then we wanted to sort of look at other drivers of this of these losses, which would be typically discharge, so what's leaving the field in water, and then application rate as well. So when we looked at the relationship between application rate on the x-axis here and N and P loss, what we found was that N loss increased with nutrient application. But again, there was no relationship between P application and P loss. And when we looked at the same relationship for total discharge from the field and N loss and P loss, again, we saw that N loss was very strongly controlled by discharge, what was leaving the field in terms of water, but there was no relationship for P loss. So we're learning more about the system in terms of what is controlling nitrogen loss, but we know less about what's happening in terms of phosphorus loss. And again, we're sort of thinking that this is related to these soil test levels. Some of Kevin's previous work has demonstrated that there's this positive relationship between STP and phosphorus load from these individual fields, especially at phosphorus soil test phosphorus levels that are greater than 75 milligrams per kilogram. So this is our hypothesis. We didn't look at that in my individual paper because we've already published this work, but it makes a lot of sense in terms of what these systems are showing. Sure.
You're not speaking to a room of professors, so 75 kilograms per...
Oh, sure. I don't.
What soil test level?
Someone else would have to answer you that question. I don't know. So I apologize that it's not in units that maybe make sense to you. But that, you know, yeah. It's what, I'm sorry, can I say to the room? Okay. It's equivalent to pounds per acre for all of those people who need that. Okay. So it's high. Anyways, thank you for pointing that out. I really appreciate that. But in conclusion, our NMP balances were strongly influenced by nitrogen and phosphorus application rates. NMP balances also varied among fertilizer sources. NMP losses were positively related to surplus nutrients within the fields, and NMP losses were controlled by different mechanisms. So when we think about things like management, what was controlling N losses was primarily things like the nitrogen balance, nitrogen fertilizer application rate, and discharge from that field. But what was controlling phosphorus losses was a little bit more complicated. It seemed to be phosphorus source, but also the soil test phosphorus levels that sort of already existed within the field. So we can manage something like nitrogen with the 4R framework, but also best management practices that can reduce the amount of nitrogen in the field or have an impact on the amount of water leaving from the field. And again, this idea of how to manage phosphorus is a little bit more complicated, but maybe can be addressed with this 4R framework. So with that, I have a lot of people to acknowledge: landowners, all of our technicians that are here in the room, Ohio State, all of our funding sources, and I will take any questions if I have time. Sure.
So, based on what you showed up there, we should be focusing all this money that we get on high soil test level fields that's giving you the export, even with no application in the current year.
Those, I think a lot of times the research does focus on these high source areas. That doesn't mean that other fields aren't also contributing to the problem, so I don't know if we should spend all of our money on that, but...
We want to focus on where we're getting our highest loss to get our...
Yeah, so the sort of hot spots are really important. Yeah, absolutely.
Your analysis of fertilizer source was essentially between organic and inorganic. If you look specifically at inorganic phosphorus fertilizers, I'm wondering if you plan to take a look at comparisons between 046O and MAP and DAP. 12% nitrogen, 18% nitrogen,
Sure.
and differences in solubility of the phosphorus form. So I guess, do you intend to look at commercial fertilizer, commercial inorganic phosphorus fertilizers to see if there's a difference in the source in that regard?
It's a really good idea. We have not planned to do it. I don't think there's any reason that we wouldn't be able to. And I do think thinking about a different time scale would be interesting when we are doing something like that. So here it's just annual numbers, but these things obviously vary seasonally as well. So incorporating some of that into that analysis is a great idea. So thank you.
I know you showed a chart up there on basically the timing of application and basically how the losses go down after time. Was that at all dependent upon rainfall? So, for example, if you apply fertilizer, let's say you go 20 days without rainfall, and you're in a strictly no-till operation, you put it on surface apply. Does that number still go down as far as the runoff number? Even though it has not been worked into the soil, does it get in there just through the action of your dews and that kind of stuff? Is that at all?
So that's a great question. And that study didn't specifically look at different rainfall events, but there have been others that have looked at time since application and then rainfall on top of that, so different intervals. And I think someone else may be able to speak to this a little bit better in our group. So we can always talk to you afterwards as well. But the time since application does have a large impact as long as there's sort of sufficient time between rainfall events. And the size of the rainfall event makes a big difference as well. can share some resources with you, I think, if you want some more details. Any more?
Well, I was just...
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me address that question, just because we do have one study or one set out of the group that did have that type of scenario. And really it's when you talk about application timing and then the next rainfall event, it's what happens in between that. And it could be in fact, we had the one site that I can think of where we were comparing manure and commercial fertilizer, and the application happened around the 1st of October, and we were got our highest losses because there hadn't been much rainfall in between on December 25th. So it can be months in relationship to that nutrient sitting on top, doesn't get incorporated into the soil, doesn't become, in essence, bound to the soil particles, that you can still get that. So it really depends on what happens between that application. You know, if we get that half-inch rainfall that just incorporates things, it can still be a big benefit in relationship to getting soil contact for that fertilizer source, regardless of whether in this case it was organic or inorganic.
Kevin's got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at the rotation, or is this single year, single field? For instance, corn, you got corn, you'll have that application for nitrogen, but the next crop may not have an application for nitrogen.
Right. So we did it within an individual year and then averaged over all of the years for that field, and then used those averages within our analysis. But that is a great point. And we were sort of looking at the difference in rotation, what crop was on the field in that individual year, but we didn't include that in this paper.
Have cover crops in there too that would soak up some of the nitrogen?
Yeah. In some of the fields we would, and it was not included in this analysis, and that would be another piece that would add to that crop removal.
And I assume you're doing phosphorus the same way, looking at the rotation?
Correct. Yeah. So things that were applied, maybe the manure was applied and then for multiple years, and it was only included in that first individual year instead of trying to separate it into different years. So that makes a big difference.
Brought down by dividing by the rotation.
Yeah, and we didn't really know how to incorporate that successfully without, and that's not necessarily something that other people have done either. So it was a new idea, and we didn't know how to do that.
My fear is people will pull that data and assume that that's for every acre, every year.
Right.
Balancing for the average.
We tried to make it very clear in our methods of what we did. So hopefully that does come through. It's in the paper. This is all published, too, if anyone would like a PDF.
What are your plans for continuing the search in the near future? And do you have sources that we can find your information research?
Yeah, so this is published. This came out, I think, last week. And I don't know access to that PDF. I have it, so I could always send it along. I think where this will go next is sort of thinking about crop rotation, how important that is in this analysis itself. I don't know if we have any other long-term goals for the balance work, the sort of nutrient budget work, but a lot of what else we're working on is this idea of event loss versus, phosphorus or nitrogen that's lost from a field during an event versus what may just be leaching out sort of long-term from everyday sort of discharge events as well. Kevin, I don't think, is here, but he could speak more to what the research goals of the whole group are.
When you reference mixed fertilizer or mixed with organic, what exactly are you meaning by that, and how did you do that? Was it that you applied manure and then you're calling mixed just what you had to supplement to meet requirements, and were those together applied at the same rate as what you're comparing them to in straight organic?
So the mixed was any fields that received an inorganic and some organic supplement. So if a field received its nitrogen as inorganic but also received phosphorus as an organic source, that was considered mixed.
Okay, but so how did you determine the rate? If your manure came on at, 10 pounds per acre, and there's plain available nitrogen with that, then did you calculate so that whatever you were comparing it to I mean, if you're mixing in commercial and you're comparing it straight to manure, then in most cases, I don't see how you would have added to make it mixed if you were trying to compare it apples to apples with manure. So I'm curious how that's
Sure, yeah, I think I might have to ask Jed to help me with this. Yeah.
By each farm, these are all actual farms. So these are all actual farms. I'm on crutches here, so I can't stand up easily. But we have 20 different farms, and each farm is managed differently. And we just classified each farm based on what fertilizer source they use. So some farms exclusively use inorganic sources like MAP, and 28 and 46 and all that. But some farms will use will side dress with 28 or something, but they'll also apply manure, before corn or something like that. So that's how we classified it here. We broke those groups of farms in those different groups, if that makes sense. So we actually we left it up to the farmers as far as what they wanted to apply. We let them do what they regularly do, basically, if that makes sense.
can't be a straight apples to apples, because if you had a manure that had 10 pounds of phosphorus and, I don't know, what it means to plant available nitrogen, 8 to 10, because that's why they do top dress, then it's not an equal comparison, because your manure is always going to be lower in some situations, depending on what it is.
What's it?
Well, so I guess I also work with Brittany, but so the whole purpose of, or the whole setup of this is a balance. So it's an account, right? You have your bank of nutrients, and whatever you're putting into the system, regardless of the source, is nitrogen, phosphorus, a combination of the both. And so we want to know how much is going into a field, and they happen to get it from two different sources. And so there's calculations that we're doing to say, okay, they're putting this many pounds of manure down, that equals approximately this much nitrogen, this much phosphorus. So we're treating it as a large system that way, and not kind of getting into the minutia of the different sources that way.
Versus organic, not applying the same rate.
Yeah. No, the rate is just considered in terms of like what they told us the rate that they applied at was, and then that's translated to the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus that was then put into the system at that rate.
So one farmer could be putting on double what another one is.
Right,
But it's all grouped together.
Yeah. Well, and that's the point of it being, I guess, why we tried to then sort of make the larger, or use the larger timescale so that we were trying to allow for some of that variation.
But she's got a good point that, if you don't balance or total number of units, it's not a good grouping. You can't take somebody who puts on 100 units of nitrogen a year and group him with somebody who puts on 200 and measure the runoff from those two different amounts. Because obviously, and I was sitting there thinking, this is not an aha moment for me. The more you put on, the more you're going to lose. I mean, it's common sense. But she's got a good point that it needs to be segregated out by amounts to be a good.
I see. So your point more so is that the groupings shouldn't just be mixed versus inorganic versus organic. It's more so the levels, which does make sense, and that is something that we could look at. It's not that that's that we couldn't do that. It was just for this analysis we did group them that way because source was our question, but because rate is the driver is more important. That's something that we could sort of
make it a better, more relevant study.
Sure.
One step beyond it is how we're working with farmers is how much is put on pre, how much is side dress, how much is wide drop, and the difference losses for equal amounts of supply. Because you're using a sum total of nitrogen. Doesn't address how it's applied or when it's applied.
Right. Yeah, and those are the other sort of components of the analysis that could then be looked at in the future. Absolutely. And I think that was the point of trying to tackle one thing first was source, and then to sort of look at the nuances that are with these other management considerations as well. So, okay.
Any other questions?
You can always ask me afterwards, too. I'm available. Yeah.
On that one slide you had soil test and didn't have anything applied to phosphorus. Was it 75 milligrams per kilogram or kilograms per hectare? Was it milligrams per kilogram?
For the slide with Kevin's research?
It was parts per million.
Yeah, because some in the group are saying pounds per acre, milligrams per kilogram is parts per million, but it's just totally different. So that would mean 150 pounds per acre versus 75 pounds per acre,
Which
is a lot different.
Right.
So I don't want anybody to be confused with that.
Yeah.
Thinking
No, thank you.
75 pounds per acre is actually so there's a
Yeah,
difference.
no wonder the
There's a
person
big
with
difference,
150 pounds per acre.
Okay. Well, thank you. And you can ask me any questions separately as well.